Welcome to Coming Clean, the podcast dedicated to common sense environmental dialogue, environmental optimism, and real environmental solutions. This show is proudly powered by Ørsted.
Trying to figure out what our government is doing can be stressful and complicated, but the beauty of ACC is we work hard not only to represent our membership to elected officials, but then to break down what those elected officials are doing for our members. Morgan Brummund is ACC's Government Affairs Director, and she joins me this week to break down everything going on around Capitol Hill, including the latest on nuclear, the Farm Bill, and permitting reform. Morgan, thanks so much for coming on the show. How are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Awesome. I'm great. We're coming back after Thanksgiving, certainly a lot to be thankful for in our world. And we wanted to have you on today to talk about just what's going on in the Hill, right? We see if you're watching news, you see that it is just pure chaos, or so it seems. But as we know, there's always a lot more going on underneath the surface of news coverage. And so particularly as it pertains to some of the environment and conservation legislation that we work on and that we watch, I wanted to get your perspective on everything that's going on. But first, I wanted to start and introduce people to you, as you haven't been on the show before, as our Government Affairs Director. And I want to know what that is. I want people to know what do you do day to day? What are your responsibilities? What are you doing as the Government Affairs Director?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Stephen. I'm so pleased to make my debut. So, as you said, I'm the Government Affairs Director for ACC Action, which is ACC's 501c4, more politically engaged advocacy arm. So, a lot of what I do on the day-to-day is, first and foremost, managing our relationships with congressional offices on Capitol Hill, and also just living in that Capitol Hill world, right? There's a lot of think tanks that we work with. ACC is not a think tank, but we do still work with a lot of our partners in the policy world on a lot of different conservation, climate, environment, energy efforts. And so that's just the world in which I live in, and essentially serve as that voice for ACC's now more than 30,000 members in Washington, D.C.
And what is it that you like most about the role? What are the things that give you energy as you're up there on the Hill and advocating for us?
That's a great question. I would say first and foremost, um, I think 5 years ago, this job would have been very, very different. And even just since ACC's founding, we have really been able to change that landscape within the GOP. We are now able to have very productive conversations on Capitol Hill and more broadly throughout the country with conservatives on environment and energy related matters. So that's a big, big part of a big aspect of my job. But I would also say that I'm able to, portray what's happening on the ground in, all corners of the country where ACC members are present and making impacts in their communities. So that really makes my job a lot easier because I'm able to chat with them and share anecdotes from on the ground, share what ACC members are doing and what they care about. And that makes all the difference when you're talking to a congressional office as well.
And so give us the rundown of what is up on the Hill. And we just came off of what felt like months of not having speaker. Now we have a speaker. Now we have, I guess, in some ways, functional Congress. But what's been the latest? There's been a lot of activity on our end, but also more generally speaking, what are you seeing going on and kind of what's your outlook through the end of the year?
Yeah, I mean, I will be blunt and say that it's been a fairly chaotic year, right? And I think that that's portrayed in the media pretty heavily. But I would say that first and foremost, we were fighting against a government shutdown for so long. I don't think that anybody was expecting a CR to pass in when it did a couple months back. And it did pass. And I think for a long time, folks on the Hill were kind of planning around that and expecting the government to shut down, and then it didn't. And so it was kind of a matter of, okay, what's next? And then we got into this speaker debacle, right? Where Speaker Kevin McCarthy was removed from the post, and now we have a new Speaker of the House. But for a long time, obviously, without a Speaker, there was, stagnation. Not much could happen on the House side. I won't really speak to the Senate side as much because it's been pretty stable comparatively. But it was really it was unprecedented to not have a speaker for that long. I mean, it was unprecedented to not have a speaker, period. So it was really interesting, and that really did take a lot of people's time. Folks who typically would work on certain issues and be, trying to write policy, pass policy, obviously couldn't really do so in the same way. Now, obviously, we have a speaker, but we are approaching the end of the year. So I think a lot of that stuff that was put on the back burner for, this fall will be, revisited, I think, on the new year.
Now, we just had Grace Sankey on the show, and she was talking about the meetings and the work that she's done with us recently, particularly around the ADVANCE Act, and we also have the nuclear fuel security legislation that's going through. Take us through those two things. Obviously, we've heard with Grace about the ADVANCE Act, and nuclear is a big priority of ours. But what is the latest, and what do you expect to get done there?
Just to briefly recap why we were on the Hill with Grace. Obviously, Grace was just on. She's a nuclear engineer and an amazing advocacy for nuclear energy. So the ADVANCE Act and the Nuclear Fuel Security Act are two really key pieces of legislation that have already passed through the Senate's version of the NDAA, which is the big defense authorization bill. So we were essentially making our rounds on the Hill to discuss with primarily members of the House and ask them to prioritize including that in their version of the NDAA, essentially through this conference that happens between the House and the Senate. So this is still an ongoing conversation. For a while, we were unsure if the House and Senate were going to actually go to conference to figure out the differences in their versions of the NDAA. But that is happening. So essentially, we have just asked folks on both the House and the Senate side to prioritize including that in the final version of the NDAA. So we're very hopeful still. These are very bipartisan pieces of legislation and very critical. They are climate solutions, but they also help with American energy independence and dominance and so on.
And then, of course, another thing that we've been working on a lot this second half of the year has been the Farm Bill. And I think if you were to rank all of the different yearly pieces of legislation that get passed, Farm Bill may be up there with in terms of what people don't know a lot about. And what may surprise people is that there's a lot of conservation-related items in the Farm Bill as well. Tell us about Farm Bill. I mean, it's big, so maybe not everything of what it is, but tell us about what we care about at ACC and what we're watching in the development of that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So for a general overview of the Farm Bill, it is a very, very massive piece of omnibus legislation that is, moves forward every 5 years. So it determines the appropriations for a variety of food and agriculture programs. So it's over $400 billion over the course of 5 years. And we actually had this last one expire in September, and we're currently running on an extension. So we have until November of next year to work out another version of the Farm Bill. As you can imagine, with something that big, there are a lot of different interests at play here. There's actually 12 titles or sections within the Farm Bill, the biggest one being the nutrition title, and that is the vast majority of funding. But then there is, in particular, ACC action is focused on the conservation title, which is the second title, and is, home to a lot of voluntary conservation programs that empower farmers, ranchers, other landowners to just simply be good stewards of the environment. So a lot of our work is, advocating for preserving the funding that has been allocated to those programs.
So give us a rundown of what some of these conservation programs look like. What are the sort of programs that that people can opt into and receive funding for, and how do they ultimately help us, fight climate change, fight some of the environmental challenges that we have?
Yeah, absolutely. So the two top programs at the U.S. Department of Agriculture are EQIP and CSP. This stands for, first of all, Environmental Quality Incentives Program and the Conservation Stewardship Program, which I mentioned previously are very much oversubscribed already. But these programs are just two examples of many programs that empower farmers to essentially be good stewards of the environment, whether that be through putting land into easements or improving their soil health, conserving water, but also just increasing the overall sustainability of their practices, which as a result is going to be more climate friendly than some traditional farming practices.
So is this an end of year thing? Is this a new year thing? I mean, I know asking someone to comment on timing in Congress is maybe a little insane, but how optimistic are you that we get this done soon?
That's a great question. So we do have this 1 year extension that buys us some more time. Obviously, given the Farm Bill is such a massive piece of legislation, it is critical that we do it correctly. I think that the ag chairs on both sides, the House and the Senate, have been really clear that they want to make this a really efficient and equitable process that's really benefiting farmers and Americans. That being said, I think that it's been made clear, and it is, in my opinion, a little bit optimistic that Chair G.T. Thompson on the House side, he would like to have this farm bill figured out by the first quarter of next year. If that doesn't happen, which obviously it very well may not happen, just given a lot of chaos in Congress and a lot of different priorities for the farm bill and other things. It would likely be, sort of more towards the end of the year where we would see this actually come to fruition. So, of course, I think folks are still really planning to dive in once the new year hits. It'll be a huge priority, but not to say that it will get done right away. But I think that's sort of the time frame that we're looking at.
So we've talked about nuclear, we've talked about Farm Bill. The one thing that we haven't seen come up necessarily in terms of legislation, but we certainly talk about a lot, is permitting reform. The latest with permitting reform, tell us there's some good news there, and what should we be watching out for?
Absolutely. So the appetite for permitting reform is still there. The good news is there's bipartisan desire to get something done or to continue to work on permitting reform. As we know, there are billions of dollars that exist for, deploying energy across the country, energy of all sources. And there are some regulatory barriers that exist right now that are making it pretty inefficient to deploy energy in the country. So good news is we've already proved this Congress that we can do some of this in a bipartisan manner. The debt ceiling included some minor permitting reform provisions, namely NEPA timeline restrictions. And there's definitely still very clear interest on both sides to get this done. So ultimately, there are bargaining chips on the left and the right that need to just be brought to the table for, productive conversations to be had. On the left, folks are very, very concerned about transmission build out to actually connect renewables to the grid. As we know, renewables are just growing across the country. And it's going to be, hard for that to be a good contributor to our grid if we don't have transmission. On the other side, the right is primarily concerned with judicial review, NEPA reform, those barriers that exist and are kind of delaying projects on the back end as well. So there's very clear priorities that have been set out, and it's just a matter of getting the right folks in the room, getting folks to realize that this is the time to do it. This is the time where it's necessary, and this is the time that it also can be done. So we're still very optimistic. ACC Action and ACC have just engaged more broadly in convening folks and educating folks on what permitting reform is, what it means for the country, how it would benefit the country and the climate, and have really been appreciative of all of the different proposals that have come out on both sides of the aisle in terms of, specific aspects of that permitting reform conversation.
Do you think things get complicated at all now with you have Senator Manchin, who has who was a big kind of leader on permitting reform and some of these other issues? He's now announced that he's resigning. You've got a very interesting majority in the House, and I think a lot of people are looking around at something as seemingly simple as permitting reform, and thinking, why can't we just get this thing done? Like, what's the holdup? But in your opinion, how does the landscape of it change with some of the recent things that have been happening in Congress?
I still think that there are so many folks. Of course, Senator Manchin has been a leader. But there have been many leaders in this space, right? Like, this conversation affects a lot of states across the country, and a lot of different people are putting forth their opinion on this matter. And so that reassures me, right? Just because, the Senator Manchins of the world are no longer going to be around to be a part of the conversation, that doesn't mean that others are not still very passionate about this issue. We also have a lot of folks who are uniquely, well versed in this issue. There are obviously a lot of different aspects of this permitting and transmission conversation. And I think what's really interesting and unique about it is we're seeing these, smaller proposals. Some focus specifically on judicial review, others are specific to transmission build out. And so there's a lot of different champions. And so I don't see the breakdown of, certain folks leaving. And then also next year, of course, being an election year, I see this as still an amazing time to get something done, and also a critical time to get something done. I think especially for Republicans in the House, who are obviously, going to probably face a rougher election year.
And then, so we've talked about nuclear, we've talked about Farm Bill, we've talked about permitting. All of these things, in many ways, still need to get fully over the finish line. As we look ahead now toward next year, it's going to be a very interesting time politically. But what are the other areas that you want to see advancement on next year? What do you think the new year has in store?
Yeah, I would say that there is ultimately still a chance that most of these things are not going to get done this year. These things that ACC action has been focused on. So the nuclear conversation is not one that can just end with the Advance Act or with the Nuclear Fuel Security Act. There's still a lot that needs to be done in the nuclear space. And there's also just still a larger conversation that needs to be had about regulatory barriers in terms of, getting energy projects out the door. I think that will continue to be a priority, during the 118th Congress. The Farm Bill is also, I think, a very, very big piece of legislation. While we have primarily focused on the conservation programs, now with an extension, I think it gives a lot of folks, including us, the opportunity to explore other areas that are important. There's a lot of technological innovation programs and things like that we're looking at, seeing where we can plug in, see how those can be effective climate solutions and also empower farmers and landowners. But ultimately, I would just say, I think that there is really going to be this appetite to get things done as we enter the new year, right? It's an election year, and it's going to be a really interesting one, to say the least. And so I think that it is now with the speaker, now with, budget issues, mostly aside at the moment, people are looking into next year and realizing that there is still a need to get a lot of things done. And I think a lot of that will happen right off the bat, probably within the first few months.
And so for people who want to stay informed about all of this, what do you recommend for people to read, to monitor, to help them navigate everything that's happening?
Well, I would first off plug the Conservation Precedent, which our VP of Comms, Colleen Matthews, and I author, and we send out, which kind of distills what ACC Action is specifically working on each week. But I would also just say that there's, if there's a specific area of policy that you're interested in, perhaps if you're interested in the Farm Bill, subscribing to the newsletters of the Agriculture Committee, whether that be the minority or the majority, whomever, I think that they're really giving you a good rundown and overview of what they want to see happen. We have also a list of partners in this space who are doing a lot of that policy analysis and research. Happy to connect with anybody who'd be interested in learning more about those resources. But there are a variety of things out there. What I would suggest is, if there's a specific piece of this puzzle that you're interested in, you find the relevant committees perhaps and the relevant leaders in this space who are talking about it the most. And that's how you follow along and get the most up-to-date information.
And then, of course, we're always updating our folks on the ACC Action social media accounts. So definitely subscribe to that as well. Well, Morgan, thank you so much. I think that anyone who works in policy and works in GA, they're special in great ways. And so we appreciate you being the voice of our activists there in DC. Is there any kind of final message that you would give to our audience who's listening this week?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I would say thank you. It is honestly a pleasure to be able to serve on behalf of our members nationwide. I appreciate every single one of them and the work that they do to make their communities better and make the national landscape better, honestly. I would also just leave everybody with a more optimistic note. I think that while the media may force you to think that things are really, really toxic right now, and of course, there have been some unprecedented times this year alone, I think that there's a lot that can be done and there's a lot to look forward to. And so ultimately, I still feel very optimistic that a lot of things can get done in a bipartisan manner. Folks do talk to each other. Folks on the left and right do talk to each other. They do have productive conversations. It's not as toxic as I think the media may portray it sometimes. And I want to make that really clear to folks. Like I wake up and I feel very optimistic. And I feel like there's a lot of things that can be done in the name of the environment and climate. And I'm very appreciative of everybody and the work that they do in this space as well.
Morgan Brummund, ACC's Government Affairs Director, thank you for joining us this week.
Thanks for having me.
And before we jump, the Coming Clean podcast is grateful to be powered by Ørsted, a wonderful company strengthening America's energy security with reliable and domestic clean energy. Through its integrated renewable energy solutions, Ørsted is creating American jobs, investing in American communities, and driving American innovation, all while preserving our country's natural habitats. A clean energy future truly connects us all, and Ørsted is helping lead the charge. To learn more, visit us.orsted.com.